Hello and welcome to the relaunch of our TGfU SIG webinar series. I am joined today by Dr. Shane Pill, who is a Professor of Education at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. Shane has over 200 scholarly articles in this area, and we are joined to talk about the Play with Purpose model. So before we kick off, Shane, could you talk to us a little bit about your background in game-based approaches?
Sure, Ninamani, which is you good in Ghana language. So Ninamani Ellen, it's great to be with you today speaking from Ghana land, and I acknowledge the connection to country of the traditional custodians of the land, and that this country was never ceded, always was and always will be Ghana people's land. So my connection to a game-based approach commences really in the 1990s when I did an AFL coaching course. Around about the same time, I was reading articles in the former Australian Sports Commission Sports Coach magazine about the work of Rick Charlesworth with Designer Games. And one of the teachers that I was working with, the head of department at the time, who had been trained in the UK, he would start all of his PE lessons with a game. And I don't think that we necessarily achieved different technical or tactical outcomes, but I was going through a more normative, progressive part, pedagogy leading to a game at the end of the lesson. And I thought, I would rather be in his PE class than my class. So I started to engage Brian in conversations around why he would start every lesson in a game. From a sports coaching perspective, reading Rick Charlesworth's work on Designer Games, and then some of the other work that was coming out from there around start every training session with a small-sided game, to context the learning, to context the retrieval of the learning that's occurred, to provide a problem-solving space. And then in Australia, we launched the Game Sense approach not long after that as a new approach, a game-based approach to sports coaching, to particularly target the motivation that young people have to play, which is we want to play the game. We go to training because the coach tells us to. What we're really after is we want to play the game. And then in that environment was also a change in the curriculum focus in physical education through a direction to a more constructivist approach, which emphasised the developing of independent self-regulated learners over time through an inquiry methodology. So the key tenets of a game-based approach that were coming out through the Game Sense approach in sport coaching were ideally suited to the teaching of games and sport in physical education through this emphasis on an inquiry pedagogy.
And you, to my knowledge, have created this Play with Purpose model. How is this applicable within sort of Australia, and how is it different to Game Sense that's already prevalent there?
Yeah, it's like a lot of the game-based approaches could be seen as versions of a version, and which was the original version that this approach is a version of. So I started to talk about the fact that I was using this Game Sense approach in my sports coaching and bringing it into an approach to teach the sport and games focus area in PE that was particularly suitable for the learning outcomes that addressing tactical and technical learning from grade 7 to year 10 in the curriculum. People were interested in what I was doing. The teams that I was coaching at the time were achieving maybe a degree of success that wasn't anticipated given the resources and the fact that we didn't have structures that independent schools and other schools might have to support sport programs. I was being asked to run some professional development. And so I started to talk about the Game Sense approach, started to read more about the background to it. And so from about 1995 through to mid-2000s, I was running a lot of Game Sense approach workshops. And I'd identified that a lot of teachers and coaches had misunderstood the Game Sense approach as game only. They were asking questions about where other coaching styles, other methodologies would fit into this idea of the Game Sense approach is playing games, which was a misinterpretation of what the approach was about. But nonetheless, that was what was being enacted, was a was really a small-sided games approach, not a game sense approach. So in answering the ambiguities that were occurring in the game sense approach, where do we do other types of coaching? Where do we do other types of practice methodologies to achieve particular outcomes if the coach thinks that those methodologies are the right ones to apply in a game sense approach, which was being advocated by some as game only and interpreted by many as game only. And so I started to talk about where other types of practice tasks would fit in the ecosphere of a game sense approach. And then people started to say to me, no, you emphasize the idea of play with purpose because you come from a teaching background. So you're really trying to get people to understand that the game is a learning encounter. The teacher or the coach has set the parameters of that learning encounter. So while it is player centered, it is still coach or teacher directed because the coach or the teacher is the one that has set the conditions, or if you prefer, from an ecological perspective, the constraints of the boundaries of behavior. And you've made clear how a game-based approach evolves from game sense games to introduce fundamental sports skills through different types of game-based experiences as players develop their understanding to eventually you're getting into match simulations and phase plays to develop the thinking for particular encounters in the game. And the game sense approach had never explained how you go from the game sense games for fundamental sports skills to applying those pedagogical principles into more sophisticated game encounters. So people were telling me that I was the first person in an Australian context to go, you go from here to here to here to here. This is how the methodology of a game-based approach progresses. Later on, I became aware of the work of Eric Worthington, who had a scale of complexity for the development of games, and his is more developed in terms of having more steps than what I was suggesting. So it's same but different, because mine was more about the go from game sense games for fundamental sports skill development to designer games to teach particular principles of play into match phase play in order to develop the scenarios that you want players to be able to experience. So when they encounter them in the game, they've already got some sense of understanding what to do in that moment because they've experienced the moments before. So people were telling me I hadn't explained it in that way. Other people hadn't explained it in that way till I did it. So I started to emphasize the idea of the game sense approach as play with purpose, and people were going, no, they're two different things. You've got to drop that language that you're using because play with purpose is a different diagram. It's a different explanation to what the game sense approach is. And people were starting to recognize the idea of play with purpose as a distinctive way of thinking about a game-based approach. And, there were some sports in Australia that started to adopt that play with purpose model that I've now developed, the schematic, as their preferred way for coaches in their sport to be thinking about the complexity, the richness, the non-linear approach, not non-linear pedagogy, because that's now got its own history, but a non-linear approach to the coaching of a sport.
And it was quite interesting there that you spoke about your background within coaching, and then we sort of briefly touched on there with a bit of teaching as well. Your play with purpose model, what's its applicability to both teaching and coaching there? Does it have the same connotations?
Yeah, there needs to be more flexibility and adaptability of the model in PE because there's more variability to the timescales that are involved in phys ed than sports coaching. And also I discussed the play with purpose model may not be applicable to every coaching session because every coaching session is not about progressing the learning of the players. So if I'm in season, my Monday night training session might be about recovery. It's not actually about stretching the players into new understandings and developing their abilities to be better players tomorrow than they are today. It's about recovery. So the model might be applied in that main training session of the week as we are developing our game understanding and our capacity to connect as a team through that game understanding to develop particular outcomes. During pre-season, there might be more applicability of the model because most of the sessions are about the players learning to play the game in the way that we want the players to play. In a phys ed sense, if you've got a time scale of an hour or two in a PE class, you might be able to run through the model. But I work with some schools that may only have 30 minutes of PE a week. That might be distributed over 4 30-minute blocks. So the first PE lesson of the week is the play for retrieval practice to test the know, do, understand, and move that into contextualizing the problem that we want the players to learn that week. The second one is where we've done the inquiry piece to work out where we need to go next. The third one is, are we back into some form of practice, or are we back into the starting game because we've cognitively focused our attention better on what we want to learn, but we're not yet ready to progress the complexity, so we go back to the game? Or is in that third lesson where we actually get to go to the next level of complexity in the game to stretch our players' learning? And then we start the cycle again. So the fourth lesson of the week, we're actually back at the start with our next development towards the next learning. Or it might be that we're going, you know what, we've just got to play the game again and not go any further. So there's a lot more flexibility, as I say, to the application of the model when we're working in a phys ed class, depending upon the time scales that the teachers are working with.
And you mentioned a little bit about the schematic there of the play with purpose model. Could you expand a little bit more on what it actually is, the characteristics of it?
Yeah, so the characteristics of it is using play as the first engagement, and that play can be for a particular purpose. The first purpose might be in order to test, to inquire whether the players are at the know, do, and understand that we are anticipating. So have they retained the learnings that we've been developing to this point? To what degree have they retained the learnings that we're after to this point, and being able to execute those learnings into action in the game? Another purpose might be to actually context the problem that we want the players to be engaging with during this practice session. So we play that first game. That enables the coach to sit back and the coach do their inquiry. Are the players, or which players, are where I anticipate they should be? Because that gives the coach the data to know where they need to do their coaching intervention. These players I can let continue to play, but these players over here I need to work with because they're not there yet. Or everybody in the group is where they need to be. So we can now open up an inquiry piece around where we go next in our learning. So painting a picture of the model, we play, we inquire, we then decide whether we go back to play. At this particular point in time, a lot of the teams that I work with now may actually go into the athletic piece. So there might be, using a football team, for example, this might be where we do some high intensity running for 3 or 4 minutes because we're wanting to develop the player's acceleration. We're wanting to develop the player's capacity to run with speed over a particular distance. And we do that in the middle of training because we want to develop then the habit of that speed moving into the rest of the training session. So from that inquiry piece, it might be up into some conditioning, and we're not yet ready to go to the next level of complexity in the game. So it's back to the starting game, or we can go into some practice, or some players go into the practice while others return to the game. But at some point, we're going to make a decision about which players or all players are ready to go to our next learning, the next game that we're going to play. And then we start the cycle again.
I've got some sort of obviously new student teachers who are thinking about applying this approach, and obviously we'll have teachers and coaches who may be unfamiliar with this. As they're going through a session or even sort of before the session, what are the kind of considerations that they need to think about? Where are the kind of pitfalls that they might encounter with this approach?
Pitfalls are not knowing your players or your students. So this is the starting point. You have to know your players or your students because I'll take a step back. Reading Eric Worthington's work from 1974, he described the art of the coach as being able to anticipate where their players need to go next because they deeply understand where their players are at in their developmental journey. So if we haven't assessed in the broadest sense of what that means, the skills, knowledge and capability of our players, then we can't anticipate where we need to intervene to help them to become better players. We're always guessing during the training session or doing a very subjective, generalized assessment of what we're going to do based on an average person or our anticipation of the average rather than the needs of the players. That's the first thing. We actually need to know our players, what they know, do, and can understand. The next point is we need to be able to differentiate our practice based on the needs of the athletes. And that's very difficult to do in a squad of 40 players, but generally we're able to look at players as maybe in pods of needs. Some players will need, I'll use an Australian football analogy, maybe some players are needing particular emphasis on ground ball work and technical ability to work in contests when the ball is on the ground. Others might be their kicking, others might be overhead. So we can look at it from the technical aspect of the game. We can also look at it from the sophistication of understanding of the ability to problem solve in a game. And again, that comes down to the coach being able to be a student of the player in motion. So one of the things I encourage both teachers and coaches to do is watch the players' heads. What are the players looking at while they're playing the game? Because if they can't see it, they can't think about it, they can't act on it. So again, if we want our players to be better decision makers, we need to look at where they're getting their information from. And if they're not getting their information from the broad spectrum of possibilities that are presenting because they've got a very narrow span of vision, then we need to be able to help the players to develop a greater capacity to span the environment. So in summary, we need to be able to know what our players are capable of from a psychomotor as well as a physical athletic perspective, because if we do, we're able to anticipate what the players will present in the game. And when that happens in the game, that's the moment we know that moment's going to occur. We've been waiting for the moment. That's the moment where we come in and do our teaching. If we can't anticipate that moment, then we're getting into the idea of perhaps, well, we're going to provide lots of cognitive dispersal during the session because we haven't anticipated the moment. And so we just go, oh, that's the moment I want, and I'm going to talk about that. Oh, here's another moment. I'll talk about that. And we've talked about lots of different things by the end of the training session. And the players will remember only the last thing we talked about because nothing's been done in sufficient depth to move it from our short-term memory to our long-term memory to challenge developing a new way of thinking or behaving.
It's very interesting you said about needing to meet the players' needs or understanding your players beforehand. And it comes back to me sort of thinking here about like one of the primary barriers to game-based approaches, this need to almost have the techniques before you have the game kind of understanding or apply within a game. I'm just thinking some people may think because I need to understand my players before we even go, I then need to do my techniques already. What sort of your viewpoint on this kind of perspective then with understanding what your players are like before you go utilize the approach?
So I'll tell a story maybe that will exemplify the answer. We've got a player making their debut in our reserves grade tomorrow who's never played football until 5 weeks ago. And they joined in training in everything that every player did from the first moment they came. Can't handball? Cool, throw the ball and we'll work on your handball progressively. Can't kick? Cool, give it a go. And then we'll work on your kicking during craft work. So we've enabled her to use the skill set that she has. She can throw the ball. She can sort of kick the ball. Coming from a soccer background, she might put it on the ground and kicked it. That's okay. That's been our starting point for her. And expanding out the play with purpose model, that practice, sometimes that's the craft work where we've identified what the players need to go and practice for their particular performance improvement. So when they develop that into a performance, then we talk to them about what the next pot of practice is going to be for the next period of time, and put that into maintenance now because we've developed that with them. We've got maybe a dozen players that are like this player that's making their debut this year, who came out to the club, can't kick, cool, have a go. But the way that we structure the experience is that they've been able to come to understand the game where they're actually saying, you know what, I may not be a great kick, but I reckon I'm ready to play the game, and I'll become a better kick over time. And there's a little bit of again, I'm going back to the 1960s and something that Alan Wade wrote about, which was reinforced in some of Eric Worthington's work. That technical stuff can occur outside of practice. Once they start working with the coaches, we're teaching them to play the game. So during our warm-up routine, we go from closed to open skills. We don't do static stretching and a couple of runs around the oval. There might be some dynamic mobility if that's what the players want to do. But our warm-up goes from closed to open drill. So they're getting technical work in that time. They're also getting different planes of motion of their movement in order to make sure that they are dynamically warmed up. But they warm up with a football from the opening minute. So from our briefing, this is what we're going to do today, why we're going to do it, and how it connects to developing our way of playing. There might be 10 minutes till we start training. In that 10 minutes, you want to go for a run, you want to stretch, you want to do shuttle runs, you want to do handball scrimmaging. That's up to you. But at this time, you're doing your warm-up. And the warm-up of our club is closed to open drills. And then when the warm-up finishes, we're into gameplay. So the players are getting some volume of practice of, if you like, technical development during their warm-up, as part of their warm-up. So it's not absent from the training. There are different points where it might come into the practice. And I think the evidence of our football club is none of these players drift away. They all have reached round one, I know enough that I can play. I'm good enough that I can have a go.
I find it really interesting because it's some of the work that I've been doing with teachers in England, and a lot of them saying, no, we can't even start a game before we've got that technique practice. But it's the sort of discussion here that, well, they've already got some form of technique before you even come to them, right? They might not do the technique how you would like it, but they have something. So getting them in the game, getting them that practice, they will develop. If they need extra development, we can take that out and sort it. It's that kind of understanding that we can put them almost straight into the game and design that game to meet the tactical needs and the understanding of the game before actually focusing on that technique. Am I reiterating what you're saying as well?
Absolutely. So we break the game down into concepts. So the first concept, Australian football, like soccer, hockey, basketball, it's a game of keep the ball away from the opposition. That's what we start teaching. You have to keep the ball away from the opposition and get the ball into a position where you can score. Can't score if you don't have the ball. So you have to, once you've got the ball, keep possession of it. How do we keep possession of it? There's a relationship between the player that has the ball and the rest of the teammates. So I use a metaphor. Number one has to get it done, win possession of the ball. Once number one gets it done, we need a number two getting in the view. So the off-the-ball player supports their teammate who wins possession by their off-the-ball movement into a position to be able to receive that. Don't make it hard for number one. Make it easy for number one by getting in the view. Then we need a number three getting out and free. So we teach our players that their relationship is a number one, two, or three, and that's a dynamic relationship. We also then bring that to a defensive number one, two, and three. Number one defensively gets it done. Number two stops the outlet. Number three is there to sweep, is a stopper. So we're creating a proximity or a relationship dynamic based upon the role that you have in the moment. The number one gets it done, tries to stop the opposition player. a tackle, get them to prop and stop, make an error. But the number one thing number one is trying to do is stop that person going down the field. It's a territory game. Stop them there. And if we can stop them there, then number two can get the next point of pressure to keep the ball there. And if they're able to get past number one and number two, we got number three at the back. So it's a game of understanding your role and understanding your relationship that comes with the role that you're doing, but that those roles aren't fixed. They're a relationship to the ball, whether we've got the ball or they've got the ball or the ball's in dispute.
And we've discussed a little bit there on sort of, you've mentioned a variety of different sports as we've talked. I'm also thinking in terms of Play with Purpose was created for an Australian context, and part of that through sort of the aspect of game sense coming through to develop your model of Play with Purpose. What's the kind of applicability to other countries or cultures that you're aware of? I know for like here in the UK, we've had the creation of the TGfU model. I know there's quite a few national governing bodies that are now trying to implement game sense. So what would kind of the applicability be across countries or cultures?
Yeah, I think it's applicable to all countries and all cultures, because the essence of why we are involved in sport, whether that be informal leisure or more formal competitive sport, is the desire to play. And so all of those models that you've talked about start from that basic desire to play. I like the way Tim Hopper explained TGfU. TGfU reversed the linearity of the common model, which was progressive part pedagogy, closed to open drill to game at the end of the session. It's linear. In a sense, Tim Hopper described TGfU as linear. Instead of the game being the end point, it's the start point. But because it's a 6-step sequence, and those 6 steps are done in order, it's still linear. Similarly, I'll probably then go to the tactical games model of the US, which was possibly more influential to me than the game sense approach in Australia was. That tactical games model from the US was play, practice, play. Again, it's fairly linear through it. Play, do a practice, which we then put into the next period of play. But I've gone, that assumes that everybody's at the same stage and rate of development. Where does differentiation come into it to meet where the player is at in their continuum of development? Where do different teaching methodologies from the spectrum of teaching styles come into it in that model? And that's where I started to develop the idea that's become the Play with Purpose model of, yeah, we do the play, then we do the inquiry piece, and then the art of the teacher or the coach is to know what comes next. And there's a menu of possibilities that can come next, not a determination of the possibility that can come next. And the art of the teacher or the coach, the mastery of the teacher or the coach, is their pedagogical knowledge to be able to go, this is the teaching style that needs to come next to meet the needs of this learner or that group of learners. But this group of learners over here, this is the teaching style that's needed to engage them in this type of task, because that is what they need next. So in some circumstances where I've seen teachers adopt the Play with Purpose model, I'm thinking of a volleyball context. Everybody might have started with the same 3v3 game to context what they're expected to know, do, and understand. Then after the inquiry piece, the 3 courts might actually be stage 1 players, stage 2 players, stage 3 players for the next part of it. So the developmental band is narrower rather than broader. So you're playing with players that are more similar than different to you. But the objective is for the teacher to get all the blue band players to green band, the green band players to red band, and the red band players up to orange band by the end of the unit of work. And the same is in the sport coaching setting. So I encourage the sports coaches to think about the stage of development of their players coming in, to have a development plan that they've negotiated with their players. And by the end of the season, they have shifted their players forward because their check-in point with their players has come from that development plan that they've initiated at the start of the season. In addition to that, the development plan is not just about what aspect of the game we're going to focus on improving. It's also about what resources can the player identify to help them to improve. What will the player do to assist their development? And those goals will be in the psychomotor domain, so they can play the game better, but they will also be social emotional goals as well. What are you doing to look after yourself to be as well as you can be during the football season? If I go back to the goals around what resources can the player identify to help them with the intention to be a better player by the end of the season in this aspect of the game, which we're going to go really hard and focus on, it's because we want the players to understand that they are responsible for their learning, and we can put the resources and tools around them to progressively help them to become more independent, self-regulated learners. And in that way, more deterministic towards the outcomes rather than having to rely on somebody else being the determining factor for their outcomes.
It comes back to very much your point of going, know your players or know your children, whatever, to have that ability to go, what choice on the menu am I picking? Okay, this group needs that, this group needs this, and that almost that communication with the players and the students or whoever to build a dialogue of how can you progress. It's almost asking the individual as well a bit of self-assessment. How can we work together to develop?
That's exactly it. And I'm reminded at this point that Alan Launder, in his P's of Perfect Pedagogy that he has in his play practice models, one of those P's is pre-test. And at some stage, you have to post-test to understand whether there has been any growth and development. That doesn't have to be formal testing. The idea of testing is an assessment. So without a baseline assessment, you're only guessing whether improvement has occurred because you have no benchmark of which to measure it against. So teaching 101 is pre-assessment to develop your learner profile. Because without that learner profile, you cannot construct the right experiences to move forward.
And speaking of assessment there, with the play with purpose model, what kind of assessment strategy? Because we have like the games performance assessment instrument, can that be used, or do you feel it can be any kind of assessment instrument that the teacher or coach has?
The game performance assessment instrument, the TPSR tool, and there are others in that sphere of tools, provide the quantitative data to get the qualitative experience. That's where their strength lies, to go from the quantitative, it is this, to the qualitative, it means this. The difficulty that we have only working with the qualitative, I watched this, and this is what I felt, is that the more experience I have as the observer, the more nuanced I can be in my observation, and therefore the more I expect of that learner. But it also means if I have the pedagogical knowledge, I expect more, but I can scaffold that person to achieve it. To take away this, you take away subjectivity when there is clear understanding of the quantitative tagging. But again, there has to be clear understanding of the quantitative tagging in order for the moderation to occur across classes, across year levels. The subjective can work if every teacher has the same mental representation of that. So when they're describing that, it's the same description to the same degree of performance. And that's where, in my experience, a lot of assessment in physical education and indeed talent identification in community clubs falls down is because there is no consistency of mental representation at different, let's call it standards of performance, for want of a better word. So my interpretation of that is different from your interpretation of that, because I expect more, I grade harder than what you do over there. So when we're working professionally with school faculties, we talk about the importance of having moderation meetings where we'll put vision and go assess. Right? Why do you put it at this standard? Why do you put it at that standard? Having heard that, would you change your score? Oh, yeah, I didn't actually see that. Didn't even see that aspect of the performance. In Western Australia, when they're doing their Year 12 moderation for their practical performances, they get the elite coaches into the room to help discern at the different grade descriptors whether they're A, B, C, or D, because that level of coaching is able to make those nuanced interpretations, because they have the experience, the depth of experience to be able to make those decisions, which a phys ed teacher, being a generalist of lots of sports rather than a specialist in narrow band of sports, doesn't necessarily have. So I think you can do it through a rubric qualitatively. I think you can do it quantitatively through a GPAI and get to the qualitative description. But what's important is the content knowledge of the person who's doing the observation, because that brings the mastery level of the observation into play. And I think that's one of our challenges working in the field, is how we raise the content knowledge of our teachers and of our coaches to be able to do that nuanced assessment.
Thank you for that, Shane. I've just sort of got a few last minute questions. Where do you see sort of the future of play with purpose or game-based approaches going?
Oh, for me, the future of play with purpose is a really easy one. The context in Australia is generally that grants fund our research, and that then leads to our research outputs. And there's no grants to research game-based approaches in Australia. So consequently, people who don't need to worry about getting grants, because that's not their career pathway, they can put their energy into researching anything they like. For those people that are seeking for a career progression, need to be more focused on show me the money, because it's not publish or perish, it's income or perish. So it's very difficult to get research related to game-based approaches underway, because it's a nice, but you got to take care of the necessary, which is get the income in. So my challenge is to find grants to fund some research to get an empirical basis to support the idea, or to say the idea is rubbish, of the play with purpose model. Or to find honest students that might be interested in picking up the project, or master students, etc. But again, the context in Australia is if you do an honours degree, it doesn't give you any extra pay when you go out as a teacher. So it's, why would you do an extra year of study and pay those higher education fees when it doesn't help you get a higher level of remuneration when you go out into the workforce? So that's why there hasn't been any, or I haven't undertaken any empirical work related to the play with purpose model, because I've been having to do these other projects, which are related to the primary function of my role as a researcher, which is generate income for the university. So that's where the future of play with purpose is, finding some people who'd be willing to empirically work with the idea. In terms of game-based approaches, I reckon the direction that we've headed in recently, where we're looking at Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of thinking about knowledge production and how that fits in with the Western notion of a game-based approach. Because whether we're working from a Anglo, a French, Horst Wine's work that came out of Germany, which I really like, it's still a European representation of the ideas. What would an Indigenous, a Native American representation of this look like? What would it look like if we were working with, for example, Younger Porter's 8 Ways pedagogy as one way of thinking about an Aboriginal framing of pedagogy to work with Aboriginal games? And when we're working with traditional games, we should be working with traditional games using traditional pedagogy. So one of our challenges is, if we want to work on world games or regional games or cultural games, we need to have a methodology that respects the culture of those games rather than colonizing those games by using a Western approach to them. So I think in order to more globally represent a game-based approach, we need to be thinking how that is culturally represented in non-European and in particular traditional cultural contexts.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting about that, representing and respecting the cultures that kind of came before, rather than the colonization aspect. So it's nice to sort of see there the respect for it and the welcoming of creating or considering the game-based approach and applying whatever form that needs to take with Aborigine or Native American sort of responses there. It's very nice to see that we're allowing that connection to the global community and also the sort of equality and respect for different cultures. So thank you for that, Shane. Sort of to finish off, would you like to sort of say a few more like words about anything that we've kind of discussed, or sort of summarize your sort of play with purpose approach before we finish?
Yeah, I'd like to urge a more connected culture of research, because what I'm seeing is that the research is happening in pockets around the world. So we've got a group that might be researching TGfU, a research that group that's doing game sense approach. I've talked about the empirical work on play with purpose, which needs to be done. I think there is a need for more comparative work around the general principles of a game-based approach, and whether they actually lead to substantially, quantifiably different or statistically significant changes in the learning outcomes. That doesn't mean that using a game-based approach is unnecessary if the outcomes are no different between approaches, because it might be the climate that we want with the students that is the difference, rather than the end outcome of the tactical and technical competency. So if players are telling us they prefer the climate of a game-based approach, which comes down to the essence of players want to play, and a game-based approach allows them to play as the majority of the learning experience, both to give it context and meaning, as well as to test it, etc. So we put more emphasis on playing, then that'll be a good thing. And it doesn't have to be justifiable on any other reason than it provides a more meaningful environment to the players, which means we're going to get people wanting to come back and play more often, rather than, you know, the narrative at the moment, if you don't come to training, you don't get to play on the weekend. No, we want players wanting to come to training. And I remember having a conversation in the Northern Territory, and this coach saying, "Oh, it's halfway through training before most of the players turn up." So that's interesting. Describe how you go through training. Oh, we'll do a couple of laps around the oval. We'll do a dynamic warm up. We'll do a couple of drills. And, you know, about half hour, 45 minutes into training, we'll start doing some match simulations. Huh. And it's about that time that most of the players are turning up. Yeah, and it frustrates them. You know, they said, why don't you start with a simple warm up to make sure the players don't injure themselves and they're mentally and physically prepped to play, but you get into the play a lot quicker. Maybe that'll make a difference. He sends me an email about 6 weeks later and goes, yeah, I'm getting more players at training more often since I've done that. So I think for me, often the thing that will get the coach to adopt a game-based approach is they see more joy from their players. They have the players turning up more often, and so therefore they persist with it. So to get more people using a game-based approach more often, we just need to get them to try it, because the players turning up to training will be the kicker for them that gets them to continue. And another example was I presented the SANFL AFL coaching courses, and I present on the play with purpose model, and I've had probably half a dozen of these examples where a coach will send me an email 6-7 weeks after this and going, I couldn't get players to training. I'm actually getting players to training and inquiries from players from other clubs who have heard our training's really enjoyable. And then numbers at training are going through the roof. Players like to play. And I'll finish with the fact that when we ask players to recall the best training session they've ever had, often they describe one where they got to play. And one particular example that I'll finish with at a semi-professional club, a player said to me, the coach used to make us do scratch matches if we'd had what he considered to be a bad performance on the weekend. And we were doing these scratch matches because they were punishment for not playing well on the weekend. They're the best training sessions we had.
Way to go there. Well, thank you so much for that, Shane. Obviously, in the chat box, you'll be able to sort of see Shane's learning through sport blog and his sort of contact details, so you can check him out on LinkedIn, etc. I want to thank Shane for joining us today and talking all about play with purpose and such an enjoyable sort of session. So thanks for that, Shane.
I appreciate the opportunity to tell a few stories. Thanks, Alan.